In 1964, as the newest museum at the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of History and Technology was about to open. The curators were faced with an interesting problem. While they were going to display in one entrance the original flag that flew over Fort McHenry and prompted the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, what should they put in the other lobby? What single artifact should they place in that lobby that every visitor would see as soon as they walked into the museum? At the height of the Cold War, the curators knew they needed one object that would summarize both the accomplishments and the dreams of American technology. In that lobby, the Smithsonian curators decided to place Henry Ford's Model T. Introduced in 1908, the Model T was the car that literally put America on wheels. Priced at $850, the Model T was the first car that average Americans, farmers and workers alike, could afford. And over the next 2 decades, Ford produced over 15 million Model Ts. To make and sell these millions of Model Ts, Ford revolutionized production by developing the moving assembly line. Next to the personal computer, the Model T is perhaps the most important single technological artifact of the 20th century, altering how products were manufactured, how cities and suburbs were laid out, and how individuals behaved and saw themselves. Yet despite the phenomenal success of the Model T, Ford was forced to stop production in 1927, and he closed his plants for months while his workers retooled in order to introduce an entirely new car, the Model A. Hence, the story of the Model T is also a story about the limits of relentlessly pursuing a single idea such as mass production. Though our story will end just short of the stock market crash of 1929, it actually starts in the middle of the Civil War in 1863. That was the year that Henry Ford was born in Greenfield Township in Michigan, just outside Detroit. It's remarkable to think that Ford, clearly one of the most important figures of the 20th century, was born during the Civil War and died in 1947, just after World War II ended. Ford grew up on a farm in nearby Dearborn. Perhaps as a sign of things to come, Ford developed early on an aversion to horses, and decades later, he would write emphatically in one of his notebooks, "The horse is done." As a child, Ford detested farm life and often spent his time tinkering instead of doing chores. His father feared that Henry had wheels in his head. At 16, Ford fled the family farm and took 2 jobs in Detroit, one repairing steam engines and the other fixing clocks and watches. After qualifying as a machinist, Ford worked a variety of jobs in which he learned about machinery ranging from steam tractors to early internal combustion engines. In 1891, Ford went to work for the local power company, Detroit Edison, and there he rose to the rank of chief engineer. While at Detroit Edison, Ford caught automobile fever. He was one of hundreds of mechanically minded Americans who became fascinated with the possibility of a self-propelled vehicle. Since the late 1860s, several German engineers, Nicholas Otto, Gottlieb Daimler, Wilhelm Maybach, and Carl Benz, have been working on a compact engine powered by gasoline. This engine was known as an internal combustion engine, since unlike a steam engine in which the fuel was used to heat the boiler and create steam outside the piston and cylinder, the fuel was instead introduced into the cylinder and ignited. The rapid expansion of the burning fuel pushed the piston and made the crankshaft turn. For early automobile engineers then, the challenge was how to control the ignition of the fuel so that ignition did not cause the entire engine to blow up. They solved these problems in a variety of ways, but most notably by carefully controlling the mix of air and fuel introduced into the cylinder and by designing light but strong engine blocks, originally made out of cast iron, but now typically aluminum. As this diagram shows, the typical internal combustion engine goes through 4 steps. First, a mixture of fuel, such as gasoline, and air is introduced into the cylinder. Next, the fuel-air mixture is compressed as the piston moves up. And at just the right moment, a spark plug fires and the mixture is ignited. Finally, the force of the combustion pushes the piston down, delivering energy to the crankshaft. By 1886, Benz had mounted one of these internal combustion engines on a carriage, but people initially showed little interest in the horseless carriage. This was in part because there were so few roads that were smooth enough for operating such a vehicle. Equally, the success of passenger trains and electric trams, people didn't think much about the need for individual transportation. Benz and Daimler, nonetheless, launched two separate competing companies, and in 1901, Daimler named a car Mercedes after a pretty young daughter of one of his partners. Benz and Daimler eventually merged in 1926 and marketed their cars using Mercedes-Benz as the brand. Demand for horseless carriages, however, changed with the rapid spread of bicycles in Europe and America in the early 1890s. Produced in quantity by using the same metalworking techniques perfected by manufacturers of clocks and firearms in New England, bicycles became a craze in Europe and America. Suddenly, nearly everyone had a bicycle, and it was not long before bicyclists began demanding better roads and before mechanically minded individuals, like Ford, began dreaming of individualized, self-propelled transportation. Inspired by some detailed drawings of a horseless carriage that he saw in the American Machinist, a magazine, Ford built his first car in 1896. Shortly after he got this prototype on the road, Ford had the chance to meet Thomas Edison, and Ford described his ideas about automobiles to the great inventor. At that time, Edison was hard at work developing an electric car, but Edison exhorted Ford to keep working on his gas-powered buggy. Encouraged, Ford quit Detroit Edison in 1899 in order to begin manufacturing automobiles. As with many new technological ventures, it took Ford several tries to establish the right sort of company. Ford first set up the Detroit Automobile Company, which made 25 cars and then failed. Undaunted, Ford found a new set of backers, and they launched the Henry Ford Motor Company in 1901. Anxious to get manufacturing on a sound footing, Ford's backers in the second company brought in a master machinist, Henry Leland. Trained in the New England firearms industry, Leland knew how to make products with interchangeable parts. Up to this point, automobile makers in Detroit had emulated carriage manufacturers and built each car individually. The parts were purchased from different suppliers and then assembled into a car by a team of craftsmen. Leland told the automakers that to make any money, they were going to have to assemble cars using interchangeable parts. To underline his point, Leland dazzled the automobile world in 1908 with a demonstration of interchangeability. Disassembling three vehicles into their basic components, Leland mixed the parts up, reassembled the cars, and then drove them for 500 miles without a breakdown. Even before this demonstration, Ford grasped the lesson of interchangeability from Leland. Ford and Leland, however, soon clashed, and Ford fired Leland. And Ford clashed not only with Leland, but with his backers as well. While they wanted to build expensive cars for the luxury market, Ford wanted to produce low-priced cars for a broad market. Disgusted with his backers, Ford started a third firm, the Ford Motor Company, in 1903, with investors putting in $28,000 in cash. In 1904 and 1905, this company sold 1,745 cars and paid $288,000 in dividends. Concluding that backers would always interfere with his plans, Ford used his share of the dividends to buy out the other investors. Now independent, Ford began manufacturing low-priced automobiles, and he brought out his Model N, priced at $600. Ford sold 9,000 cars, and he took in $5.8 million in 1906 and 1907. Building on the success of the Model N, Ford started planning a new car in a locked room in the back of his plant. Dubbed the Model T, Ford's new design was to be a low-priced automobile for a mass audience. As Ford explained later, his vision for the Model T was that it should be, and I quote, "a motor car for the great multitude, large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. Constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs modern engineering can devise. So cheap that any man making a good salary will be able to own one. Recognizing that more than half of all Americans still lived in the country in 1907, Ford decided that the Model T would have to be rugged and easy to repair if it was going to be useful to country people. Boxy in its basic design, Model T weighed only 1,200 pounds and was 100 inches long. With its four-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine, the Model T could achieve a maximum speed of 45 miles on a straight and smooth road. But the Model T nonetheless had enough power that it could get itself unstuck in mud or snow. Model T drivers recalled frequently that the throttle and clutch levers were mounted on the steering shaft and that the car presented them with 3 pedals, one to go forward, one for reversing, and one to stop. To give the car strength but keep it light, Ford made key parts out of vanadium steel that was 3 times stronger than ordinary steel. Ford realized that to make cheap cars, he would have to make a lot of them, and that led him to experiment extensively with production methods. In order to try his new ideas, Ford and his associates would come to the plant on Sundays when they were not going to interrupt ongoing production, and there they would test their ideas. Borrowing on existing practices from other metalworking industries, Ford and his team created what they called a line production system. And this system consisted of placing machines and workers in a carefully planned sequence of operations. Next, his engineers began installing conveyor belts to carry parts to the workers, a practice that was similar to the conveyor belts that were used to assemble orders at the Sears Central Warehouse, and that's something we talked about in Lecture 21. Ford and his team began using conveyor belts to create a moving assembly line. Workers stood along the moving belt and performed their task on parts moving past them. Ford tried the moving assembly line first for putting together flywheel magnetos and then for the engine. In 1914, Ford and his team created the assembly line on which the chassis and the car moved along. Using the assembly line, the time expended on making a Model T dropped from 12 hours and 8 minutes to 1 hour and 33 minutes in 1914. By that time, Ford's plant at Highland Park in Detroit was turning out 1,000 Model Ts a day. Ford's assembly line allowed output to soar, but this increase came at the price of eliminating skill and worker satisfaction. As Ford installed his assembly line, he realized that his company was experiencing extremely high turnover rates for workers, on the order of 300% annually. Workers would come to work on the line, become disgusted with the monotony, and then quit. Ford managers were also spending too much time having to recruit new workers. In response, Ford announced in 1914 that he would increase the starting wage at his plant to $5 for an 8-hour day. This was double the prevailing wages in the automobile industry. These higher wages gave Ford an advantage in recruiting the best workers and demanding higher levels of effort from them. It also allowed Ford to increase the speed of his line. Ford himself claimed that the $5 wage was his way of sharing the company's lucrative profits with the workers. In the 1910s, as Model Ts became cheaper and more common, they exerted a profound influence on daily life in America. In the cities, the T permitted people to move away from downtown and relocate into single-family houses in the suburbs. Families were able to go on automobile vacations, and that stimulated the development of highways, gas stations, tourist camps, and roadside attractions. Companies sprung up to produce all sorts of accessories for converting the Model T into a camper. Young people used the car to establish their independence from their parents. Teens often took the family Model T to drive into town to see a movie or to go on unchaperoned dates. Because it was cheap and convenient, the T promoted the expectation in individuals that they could travel wherever and whenever they wanted. Perhaps the group that was most profoundly affected by the Model T were farmers. From an economic standpoint, the Model T was most useful to the farmer because it made it cheaper and easier to get crops to market or to the rail depot or the processing plant. For example, when the tomato crop was ready in South Jersey, Small farmers would pack bushels of the red fruit into their old Model Ts, and a long line of dusty cars would form at the Campbell's Soup plant in Camden. Farmers also found the Model T to be a convenient source of power. By jacking up the rear wheels and connecting the drivetrain to a belt, farmers were able to use the car's 20-horsepower engine to do all sorts of things: to cut wood, grind grain, shear sheep, churn butter, and even run a washing machine or an electric generator. One proud farmer proclaimed that his Model T could do everything but, and I quote, rock the baby to sleep or make love to the hired girl. Because the Model T was rugged and easy to repair, farmers regularly repaired and modified the car. Model T drivers, noted historian Reynold Wick, usually claimed their cars could be fixed with twine, wire, clothespins, or chewing gum. The only tools needed were a screwdriver, a monkey wrench, a hammer, and a pair of pliers. Since the Model T never changed, farmers frequently held on to the old car even when they bought a new one. Much like a horse, the old car would be put out to pasture. And I remember as a kid in the 1960s seeing old Fords out in the field on family farms being kept for spare parts. But the Model T also affected farm families socially, as it allowed them to come to town more often, to socialize, and to attend church. Many farm women learned to drive the Model T, and it allowed them to be more independent of their husband and families. Even more broadly, with the Model T, Ford helped launch a consumer revolution. If life for Americans in the 19th century had been about production, about taming and reshaping the land as farmers, pioneers, and craftsmen, in the 20th century, American life became much more about consumption, what we buy and what we do for leisure. And Ford with the Model T was at the heart of this transition. Ford described the consumer revolution in the following way. Well, say, we're creating new wants in folks right along, aren't we? And we no sooner get those wants satisfied in one class of society than another class bobs up to present its needs and demands. The wants keep right on increasing, and the more wants, the more business. Isn't that so? Notably, Ford appreciated that the rise of consumer society meant a shift from saving to spending. Early on, Ford was handed a draft advertisement with a new tagline: buy a Ford and save the difference. Ford crossed out the word save and replaced it with spend. With one stroke, Ford expressed the essential idea of modern consumer society, one that was needed if one was going to mass-produce cars like the Model T. While the moving assembly line had allowed Ford to increase output dramatically, Ford was determined to continue to drive down his costs, lower the price of the Model T, and capture more of the automobile market. In his relentless pursuit of efficiency, Ford broke ground for a huge plant at River Rouge in Dearborn in 1916. When completed in 1927, the Rouge consisted of dozens of mills, forges, docks, and assembly lines. The Rouge produced its own steel, glass, paper, and fabric, all of which were converted into automobile components and subassembly lines. In turn, these components came together as automobiles on the main line. To supply the Rouge, Ford integrated backwards, and he purchased forests, coal mines, iron ore deposits, and even rubber plantations in South America. To carry all these materials to the Rouge, Ford invested in a railroad and a fleet of Great Lakes steamers. Ford's efforts to cut manufacturing costs paid off, and he was able to drive down the price of the Model T from $850 in 1907 to $263 in 1927. By 1927, Ford had sold 15 million Model Ts, and they constituted half of the automobiles manufactured up to that time in the United States. Starting with capital of $28,000, the Ford Motor Company was now worth $715 million. Ford personally controlled the company, and he was a billionaire. But Ford did not fully comprehend the changing nature of the automobile market. To avoid the costs of having to retool his plants, Ford had frozen the design of the Model T. Between 1907 and 1927, the Model T remained the same, an open car which was started by turning a crank, which had a temperamental planetary transmission and a maximum speed of 45 miles an hour. While the first Model Ts were painted green, Ford switched to making only black cars after 1914 because black enamel dried faster than the other colors. And Ford would tell his customers they could have any color they wanted as long as it was black. But between 1907 and 1927, other automakers had introduced faster cars with electric starters and closed bodies. Customers could choose the color they wanted. Many Americans bought a Model T as their first car, but as their income grew, they often chose to replace their Tin Lizzies with new cars with better features. Ford's major rival, General Motors, Alfred P. Sloan and his managers studied how Americans were purchasing automobiles, and in the 1920s, GM began offering new models with new features every year. GM offered a whole range of cars, or as Sloan liked to put it, one for every purse and purpose. As Model T sales slumped in the mid-20s, Ford was forced to take a drastic step. While he and his engineers designed a new car, the Model A, he shut down the River Rouge plant and manufactured no cars in 1927. During that year, General Motors and other automakers had the entire market to themselves, and they gained a great deal of ground on Ford. Americans liked the Model A and bought 1,400,000 of them in 1929. And my grandparents fondly recalled the Model A was one of the first cars they bought. But even with the Model A, Ford was never able to recapture a dominant share of the market, and GM became the leading car manufacturer. Unlike Ford, who had concentrated on production, Sloan at GM realized that long-term success would depend on matching production with marketing. Indeed, modern companies today fully understand the importance of balancing mass production with mass distribution. It does not pay to solve the challenges of making millions of units of product unless you can devise marketing techniques, such as branding, model changes, and advertising that will help convince millions of people to buy your product. Inventors and engineers, as I often tell my students, have to have one foot in the technical realm, understand production, and the other foot in society, to be aware of how and why people purchase your product. In John Steinbeck's 1945 novel Cannery Row, one of the characters remarks, "Someone should write an erudite essay on the moral, physical, and aesthetic effect of the Model T Ford on the American nation." And indeed, E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Web, already had. In 1936, White recalled, "The last Model T was built in 1927, and the car is fading from what scholars call the American scene," which is an understatement, because to a few million people who grew up with it, the old Ford practically was the American scene. It was the miracle that God had wrought, and it was patently the sort of thing that could only happen once. Mechanically uncanny, it was like nothing that had ever come to the world before. Flourishing industries rose and fell with it. As a vehicle, it was hardworking, commonplace, heroic. And it often seemed to transmit those qualities to the person who rode in it. I suppose it's time to say goodbye. Farewell, my lovely. Those curators at the Smithsonian were right back in 1964. Few other inventions demonstrated both the ingenuity of Americans in terms of production and engineering, and even fewer were inventions that so thoroughly changed American life and captured the imagination of people. Yes, E.B. White was right to prepare a eulogy for the Model T, to say farewell to an old and dear friend.